This episode of the Everything Matters podcast is brought to you by BeLegendary.coach, where we transform leaders into legends. Are you a senior leader, entrepreneur, or executive looking to take your leadership to the next level? Are you dealing with things such as imposter syndrome, concerns with whether or not your leadership is lingering long after you've completed face time? Looking for new and innovative ways to connect with your team and to gain buy-in from stakeholders that you deal with on a daily basis? If any of this sounds like something that you're dealing with and you would like to take your leadership to an extraordinary level, your effectiveness to a legendary level, visit BeLegendary.coach. That's www.belegendary.coach and schedule your free performance analysis today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Everything Matters podcast. I'm your host and CEO of BeLegendary.coach, Bradford Speaks. My guest on this episode of the podcast is Dr. Kelly Page, affectionately known by many as Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly has spent the past 2 decades learning, researching, and co-designing with people and communities across multiple countries and cultures on the social design of how we live, learn, and work with technology. Dr. Kelly has explored lived pathways of learning and earning and the role of technology with learners and earners in the areas of the arts, restaurants, healthcare, and education sectors to youth, adult, marginalized individuals, and veterans, as well as K through 12 to post-secondary and workplace contexts. Dr. Kelly is on a mission to share all we know and learn on the social design of technology with the world, because she believes that knowledge only impacts change in people's lives when it is used. And the fastest way to close the literacy skills gaps is by sharing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Page to the Everything Matters podcast. Let's get it popping. Hello, Dr. Kelly. Thank you so much for coming on to the Everything Matters podcast, being my guest today. So excited to have you. I tell you what, I just watching a few of your talks, your TED Talk, and some of the school board talks you've done with people. You're a brave soul, and you don't mind. You have no fear of being canceled. Unlike me, I'm trying not to get canceled in this world. So we need more people like you in the world. And I thank you for your message around education and really social design, which is a really interesting concept that I'm so anxious to get into. So welcome again. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to connect with you, also learn about what you're up to in the world and how we can collaborate and work together.
I love it. I love it. So do me a favor. Obviously, you've got a little bit of an accent there. So, some people might think because, my Aussie colleagues often, sometimes I can't tell, like I get them mixed up and they're like, is that English? Is that Aussie? Is that? And they're like, Bradford, come on. I'm like, dude, I don't know. I'm still learning here. So I'd love for you to give us I'd love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, where the accents come from, and where you grew up, sort of how you grew up, and a little bit about who you are, Dr. Kelly.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I get that a lot, right? So I was born in Australia and grew up there and I left Australia when I was about 26. So, but growing up in Australia, I grew up in a immigrant, multiracial family. My mom's family from South Africa. So sometimes you might get a little bit of the South African twang. My dad's family is Australian, but also Welsh, Celtic, British Australian. So we very different kind of upbringing from working on and living on farms to my dad being a truck driver, my mom a teacher. Really influenced me. So sometimes my accent, I also spent, when I left at 26, I had an opportunity to work in the UK. So you might get a little bit of a British Welsh twang that comes across.
That's what I'm saying, man. It's confusing for us Americans,
It is. You should see my grammar and spelling. I have to use, American spell check just to make sure I'm using the right words.
I bet, right?
Yeah. So, and then I moved to America. I've been here now about 13 years. And, my sisters who brought me out here, she lives and works in Los Angeles. And I used to visit all the time. And then, came out and started working here.
Okay. So you live in Los Angeles now? Is that where you're living?
No, I'm in Colorado.
Okay. So kind of Midwest, West, sort of, kind of? Yeah.
Midwest. 11 years in Chicago. And 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I moved out here to Colorado because
very cool.
The hiking was just a little bit, better.
Just a little bit better. Chicago can be a little flat,
Yeah.
Outstanding. So thank you again for being here. And I want to just jump right in, Dr. Kelly. One of the things that you talk about is a term. And, I know that things are being designed around us all the time. And you use a very interesting idea here called social design of technology. Mm-hmm. And I just really would love to give the audience an opportunity to know what you mean when you say social design. What does that mean?
So, when we think about our world, we participate in the design of our world, as human beings, as friends, as colleagues, as family members. Mm-hmm. And in social design, it's really looking at the social structure of how things come to be, who plays a role in the design of different things, what influences that design. And at the heart of it is co-design. And it's a recognition that actually sometimes in different systems, people are designing for us, and sometimes we're participating in that design. As technology has advanced, our data plays a very key role in the design of many technologies, whether we know it or not. So it's starting to understand and look at the role that we can play as individuals in the design of our world, but also the world for other people, and become very conscious of the, social elements that are constantly impacting why things are the way they are and how we can play an active role to actually influence that.
Man, I would love to play a more active role. I'm tired of my life being designed for me. I'd love to be able to say something, have a say so, especially that thing that you mentioned called data. I would love to be able to take my data and control it, maybe even sell it. If I want to sell it, make a little bit of money, and somebody else selling my data. I'm sick of being sold out here, man, these streets,
Yeah, so, totally. Yeah.
Outstanding. Now, one thing you said on your website, Dr. Kelly, is, and I kind of summarized this into your mission, as I would call it. And please, elaborate on that if I'm off base a little bit. But sort of what I took was that you're looking to color literacy skills gaps through education. Could you expand on that sort of idea for us a little bit, and how social design, I guess, sort of plays into that?
Yeah. So when you think about the design of school, the design of education, post-secondary as well, there are certain individuals who have played a key role in designing the structures, the courses, the classes, who gets accepted, who doesn't get accepted, and what we pay attention to in the learning environment. Now, as human beings, we are 24 hours, we learn. We are never not learning. So one thing around the design of education and learning, I often say that learning is what you do for yourself, because we're constantly learning.
Yes.
Education is often what's done to you. And so it's really interesting to look at when we think of skills and literacy and so forth. It's been designed in certain a way that it benefits certain people because it's been designed for and by them. And it excludes certain people or certain approaches or ways of thinking. And so when we think about really addressing the gaps in skills and literacy, I actually think the main way we can do that is by including people. So the more you are involved in the design of school or the design of classes, if you have a child, a daughter, or what have you, it influences your understanding of how these things work and how they're designed. And it also gives you a voice at the table. So it's starting, and it's not just at school, it's also in the workplace, and starting to understand that historically in social design, we are social animals. That's another element to be aware of.
For sure.
And the world has been, we've been constantly designing for a millennia and building, creating. There's different ways to talk about it. So by actually opening up and accepting that and being visible, who's at the table, who's designing, how are they designing, what's their story? So your story influences what you build. So if we can start to open up more the design processes of how things are developed, have more community engagement, and so forth, then we're not just having people at the table, we're also influencing their education and their literacies and their skills. So it's like when we think about data. data, its development, especially over the last 20 years, has moved from data about product to data about people and profiling people. Now, if you're part of that conversation, you become aware of what's being collected on you, how it's being used.
Right.
And then we can start to look at consent models so that you can have more consent over your data. And if you want to sell it, you want to make some money off it, why not? Companies are making money off it. So that's really what, when we talk about using social design, the more we can share about how data and technology is built and designed and involve more people in that conversation, we'll start to see the skills and literacies gap closed.
Yeah, I like that.
Because people have more agency.
Yeah, I like that. And I think part of that is also being able to, people stopping to read, right? I mean, because these consensual contracts that we sign every time we log into Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, we're kind of giving away all our rights and all the right to any content that we put on those platforms. And so that's a whole different conversation. So, you know, I got a question for you. This is kind of a personal question.
Yeah,
where do you stand on, and you know, people, to your point, you know, whoever designs the education system, if you will, for lack of a better word, has a lot of say and a lot of influence on what that looks like and what gets taught. Where do you stand? And also, before I ask the question, there's also an economics element that you have to consider, right? So where do you stand on compulsory education just in general? Because my take is that there should be more say from the people that are in the community where they're being educated versus someone just at the top giving you this agenda, this curriculum that you should study based upon whatever they think is important, right? And it may or may not be setting you up for success. It may or may not fit into your natural gifts and skill sets. So where do you stand on compulsory education? And if you could pick your ideal educational setup, what would that look like?
Oh, wow. I love this question for a number of reasons. So I actually don't believe in compulsory anything because I believe in agency. So I think if we are truly to start to build and design with consent at the heart and people having agency, then we need to involve them in that decision. So that said, you also need to look at in terms of learning models and how humans learn and why it is beneficial to society for education to be a public good. So therefore to be available to everyone and free. So, and I'm going to come back to the economic model because it does work in other countries where you see Scandinavian countries where post-secondary education, undergraduate degrees are free. When you look at school systems in Australia, for example, I would say we have economic opportunity because of our education privilege. And the education in Australia is free and affordable. So it's super interesting. Like we have a small network of private schools in Australia, but our public education system is so good. It's interesting to sort of look at it and go, well, why go to a private system when the public is good and it's free? So it's like, it's interesting to look at it that way. So for me, I believe in agency and consent. If you are going to have a public education system, you need to then have people involved in the design because it's for the public. It therefore should be by the public. And what does that mean? So in terms of the model of education I love, I was exposed to a model that came out of Italy after World War II. And it's called Reggio. And Reggio model of learning. And it was interesting because the people in the town of Reggio got together after World War II. They did not want a repeat of the atrocities. So they designed collaboratively a model of learning. They had a number of individuals who took the lead that is very community focused. It's social. The children in a Reggio school, and there's over 300 Reggio inspired schools in America. Wow. And the children, they're seen as little people, not as students. So being a student and being a teacher is a practice, not a role. Right. So at any one time in the classroom, the teacher is the adult is learning as well as the child is learning. So it really changes the power dynamic in that environment. it's also very much designed within the community. So parents play a role in the school. Specialists in the community play a role. And so instead of it being, and I was really hoping during COVID that COVID would disrupt the model of our big school districts.
Unfortunately, it didn't. Unfortunately.
It didn't.
Yeah.
But, we talk about banks being too big to fail. Well, our school districts, we have to look at the design of them and why they became so big over having smaller school environments and school districts that really support the people in the community. Chicago Public School, that's CPS is a prime example. It took smaller school environments anywhere up to 2 weeks to get their communities online for online learning. Wow. It took Chicago Public Schools over 12 weeks. And they first had to figure out, and this is another thing for us to talk about, how do we socially design getting free breakfast and lunches to the children in their homes, right? If we had to feed them before we could think about educating them. So Reggio is a model of learning, and there's no model that's perfect, right? But the way it approaches community and the way it involves parents and it involves people in the design of school, the children also have a role in designing the curriculum. Now, some teachers, some adults don't like this.
Sure. What does a kid know? They don't know anything about designing education curriculum. Well, actually, they might know more than you realize, right?
Yeah, but it's a model of learning where at the very start of a semester or a quarter, the children with the adults go on an exploration asking questions about the things they're curious about. It's then up to the adults to bring into the classroom. So say, for example, and every quarter is based on a project. So the grade 4 class might be, fascinated by the human body. And so for that quarter, they as a class do a project exploring everything about the human body. And it's up to the adults to bring into the classroom math, science, English, arts into the project so that they are developing the skills, but in a project-based environment. So it's less rote learning. Most Reggio schools do not have standardized tests other than a few.
Okay.
And that is so that they require them for reporting to the state or what have you. But it's a model of learning that I would say is far more inclusive. But it started in early childhood.
Okay.
And now we're starting to see schools expand into high school. So out of early childhood and middle school into high school. And I actually think it's a model of learning we can use in post-secondary.
That's interesting. Very interesting. It's what I find interesting about that, the Reggio model, is that my kids, 3 of them, when they were really young, their very early school years, they went to Montessori school, which ironically is Maria Montessori, who's Italian. So it's interesting that the Reggio model comes out of that whole ordeal too. But what I loved about that model, and there's a distinction between, international Maria Montessori certified schools, and then because I think she licensed people to be able to use the Montessori name, but not all of them are certified in the same way. So for anybody that's out there looking to maybe put their kid in a Montessori school, do your research.
Definitely.
So I loved the idea, and it's a lot like what you were saying. It was they would have an international day every year. And so they would look at cultures from all over the world, and they would put skits on and plays, and they would have dance and music, appreciating everybody's culture, what everybody brought to it. And it just created this space of community. They had plants that they had to take care of, vegetables they were growing out back. They had pets that they had to be responsible for. They looked at them as little people, just like you said. I mean, like you come there and like everybody had a responsibility. Hey, you're going to clean up. They teach how to wash dishes, dry the dishes, and they work together to put things away. It was like this. It was really brilliant. I love that model of learning. And I really wish that I could have afforded to keep them in that model throughout school. But I think it would have made a huge difference with who, they will become. Not that there's anything wrong with who they are now. My kids are brilliant. They're great. But I think that would have made a huge difference in the way they saw the world and in the inclusivity that model boasted was just phenomenal. So I can see the value that you're talking about.
And we can have these models in a public school education system.
Yes.
We just choose not to. Or we're so indoctrinated into a way of design
Yeah.
in our public school system, plus the economics of it. We have to look at the economics of our schools, how they're funded. That is a very important part of it. But it's interesting. It's like the community model. In Reggio schools, and I was working in one in the innovation lab in Chicago. And as you said, the children learned about how they did family style eating. They all the tables were round, and they would sit together in a community.
Yep.
They would wash up, they would serve each other. And so it's about community values. And that to me is something I definitely lean into, because it's about we over the I.
It is. And so in your research, and as you've kind of, you've coming from Australia and then seeing the education system here, and I would imagine you've gone back a couple of times in some of your research and really did a comparison. What do you see as to why is it so hard here? Because you look at the economics, and there's no secret that teachers are grossly underpaid. There's no secret about that. And so why is it so hard to get the education system, the model, to change? If we know, all the parents can see, the community can see that this will benefit the kids immensely. So why is the leadership not willing to make the change? What is that?
Well, I think it comes down to leadership doesn't want to lose its leadership, right? And the fear around doing something different, doing something that is quite radical. And it's radical for here. It's not necessarily radical. So for example, in Australia, we have a regional school system. So while you have regions, there are individual schools in the region. They collaborate, they work together, but there's not these large school districts, right? So you enable more customized, tailored learning to the region. And one region is very different to another. It is just like, schools on the west side of Chicago where I work were very different to in the north side. But what was interesting on the economic model is they all get the same funding. Whereas in America, the funding model is based on housing taxes, right?
Right.
So whereas if those housing taxes went to the federal level and then every state was issued with a budget, an education budget, that was relative to the taxes that came from its state, and then the state distributed to the schools equitably, then it's very different. Whereas at the moment,
Dr. Kelly, come on, that's just true.
So it's the economic model, and that's why schools in one city, literally streets apart, get such different funding. And it's like, no, you have 100 kids in this school, 100 kids in that, even though it's thousands. It should be very different. And so the economic model we have to change. Also our school boards. So I'm just going to I'll get canceled after this, because I'm just going to go straight to the top,
Don't talk about the school boards. No, please talk about the school boards. Please say it.
So the social design of school boards, in who is on the board, who serves on the board, and the kind of decisions they're making, is very much at opposition of the actual school and the teachers. So when you think about, many school boards are filled with individuals of the local communities who are business people who have vested interest in the school budget. Our school districts, because they're so large, have huge budgets. And so when I won't mention who this is, but one of the mayors in Chicago, outside Chicago, so it wasn't Emmanuel.
Okay.
It was really interesting to learn the level of influence the mayor had over the budget and the spend for contractors from the school. And I remember I was being interviewed for doing some innovation work with one of the school districts in the west side of Chicago. And it was really interesting to me that I had to have lunch with the mayor to be evaluated for, it could have been my Australian background, but it was a really interesting experience to go, oh, wow, this is how different school districts function. In the community involvement is very top down, as opposed to parents having more of a say at school boards or so forth. Who and how gets elected to your school boards? Now, voting across America, just full stop. We need to be looking at our voting system. So, for example, in school boards, to sort of see who does and does not vote and who can and cannot run for school board positions, it's very political, obviously, and that also influences the decision-making of our school boards. I would say Australia doesn't have school boards like you have school boards, which totally changes and decentralizes decision-making to the principals and the regional directors. Yeah, it's very different.
Wow. This centralization thing is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It really is. Education being centralized, all this money going into one place, and one person, or a couple of people, a handful of people having the kind of power that they can wield and have this money be directed anywhere they want it to go. And we know it's not all going back to the kids. No. Who knows where it's going, right? The centralization of our monetary system is also a problem globally. Mm-hmm. I had a gentleman on the podcast recently, and we were talking about that. And, the centralization piece is it's too much control in too few hands, and the community needs to have more involvement and more really more say and more power in that regard. So in the social design piece, the next question I wanted to ask you is, how do you see, an innovative new way of designing society, is what you're saying, essentially, through education? What are some of the impacts that you see this new design and innovation having on humans and human behavior in particular? What are some of the outcomes and benefits that you see?
While we can start with education, it's a workforce system as well. We can also think about our workplaces. So in terms of a new social design, we need to learn how to lead together, how to collaborate together, how to come together. And so when I think of certain different ways, and the only way we start is by starting, right? Is by having a community of practice, bringing people together to discuss an issue or talk about a resource they're going to develop for the community. And it's starting to have more community-driven initiatives. Mm-hmm. However, they have to have power and agency, and they have to have money. So otherwise, you can get a group of people together to talk about something, but they don't have the funds to implement anything.
Right.
And so it's really starting to value the communities of practice and starting to develop different ways of doing things as opposed to the hierarchical power and control, right? So centralization, hierarchy, and power, it's actually military strategy. It's, it's a very different kind of environment, and it is to control versus share control. And this is where our leadership needs to change in how we lead and how we learn to lead. And it's not easy, right? You're going to have people with very different opinions. And it's how do you form consensus? How do you have equitable voting mechanisms so that people can also vote anonymously if they want to on certain initiatives? So it starts with us just thinking differently think differently about your family and how you might involve your children in decision making. Yeah. And why is it beneficial for that to happen when they're younger versus them learning at 18, now I need to open a bank account and how to, manage a bank account, or get a loan of, $60, $90, $120,000 for college, not knowing any financial literacy skills.
Absolutely.
So, or very little. So it's recognizing that we live together, we work together, we're in a community together. So then let's discuss and make decisions together.
Right.
And the other thing, though, it takes a lot longer. So the model of efficiency that we all work in, and we've got to do 100 things at once and get them all done tomorrow, that sense of urgency, which is very much white supremacy, we need to actually push back on that and go, you know what? If it takes an extra week, it takes an extra week. As long as we have the right people at the table or the people we need at the table to help discuss. Right. So community level initiatives or inclusive innovation is another way we talk about it. It's a very different model, and it actually leans more into indigenous cultures, Asian cultures. And so we need to be really open to learning about what that looks like.
Wow.
Yeah.
Said a mouthful.
I know. I talk a lot.
That was, man, brilliant. So, you mentioned, being in both countries and seeing sort of how things look on both sides, right? How do you see, it's funny, I was talking to a friend earlier about, he'd lived in Japan and lived in other places around the world. And I was asking him, and I always ask people who are from America, particularly Black people who have lived in other countries. And I always ask the question, is racism a thing over there? And I've got a friend who actually lives in Australia. He's a black guy. You know, you grew up in the UK, lives in Australia now. And I was asking him the question. He said, no, man, it's not like, certainly not like it is in the States for sure. You know, and there's what it is in the States, and then there's what the perception that people outside of the United States think it is in the States too, which I think are a little bit different. You know,
Totally.
It might be worse to some people when you're actually here. It might be not as bad when so it depends on what you're evaluating, right? So what do you know, and a lot of the communities in the United States are certainly separated by socioeconomic lines, right? Economic, I would say more so, because whatever money you make, you know, if the more educated your parents are, the more money they make, that's going to determine what kind of school district you go to, 100%. Which leads me to love the way that you're talking about it. We take all this money, right? So how do you get people who live in this really nice area to say, to be okay with taking their hard-earned tax dollars, right? They pay their taxes every year, $10, $12, $50 a year, and go and educate this poor community over here. I don't like that idea, Dr. Kelly. How do you get people enrolled in something like that? Like the greater good, right? And I think this is a massive issue that we're dealing with, I think, in general across the planet, is that, you know, again, depending on how you're looking at it, some people say, well, it's a socialist idea. You know, it's everybody taking care of everybody else.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? You know, to some degree, I mean, and I kind of split the fence both ways. Where do you stand on this whole idea?
So I think you know where I stand. It's like,
I want the audience to know where you stand.
So you started with when you think of discrimination, bigotry, racism across the world, it is everywhere, right? This is not a purely American experience of racism. So to give you some background, so my grandfather is biracial. My grandmother is white. They met and married in South Africa. My grandfather sent my mother and her sister off to a convent to be raised by nuns at the age of 4 because they were questioned so much on their parents, right? Like, so to be educated. For him to enter Australia, and this tells you about Australia's colonial history, it was just after the White Australia policy got lifted. And the White Australia policy
I never heard of that. Enlighten me.
Yeah, it's an immigration. No, it's an immigration. It was law that there was preference made to people who came from white European countries. And it was discriminating against Asian people from Asian countries because Australia's racism is more about Asian racism than what I would say about Black racism. Wow. That said, Indigenous peoples have been discriminated against since the very, very beginning of when Great Britain colonialized and invaded Australia. So we have a very interesting history with racism, but I would say it's different in how it's implemented and propagated. That said, I would say our government has done a lot more. Like John Howard, and I'm not going to, whether I favor any prime minister, this is not that I love John Howard or anything like that, but one thing I appreciated what he did, he actually came out to begin reparations to apologize to our Indigenous peoples for how they were treated. Yeah. We have also a healing that Australia is going through and will for generations to come. There was a government initiative, I think it started in like the 30s, the 40s, and it's children were taken away from their Indigenous parents to be raised by white parents and in boarding schools and so forth across Australia. It's called the Stolen Generation. Wow. And so we, very similar to how Indigenous Americans were treated, we too have that history. One thing I appreciate is that we're on the journey of healing and that there is open conversations about all sides of discrimination, sexism, racism, but it exists. It's a lived experience. Right. Anyone who says that any country is not racist, I'm like, have you visited? Have you hung out? Have you lived there? Live there and then talk to me about it. But it's interesting we have to make it visible, have the conversations so that we can heal and we can learn from each other. There's an approach to diversity and inclusion work that's called interculturalization. Okay. And that's where we learn about different cultures and ethnicities so that we can integrate and we can learn from each other. Right. as opposed to multiculturalism is about multiple cultures that are separate. So it's another thing that I think we can do a lot of work on around, like I fundamentally believe we need inclusion before we can have justice, before we can have equity, we have to have inclusion. And so that's part of the role of starting to look at how we design together.
Man, such a hard hump to get over, it seems. I do commend Australia for doing that work. And, I think there's a healing that certainly needs to take place in the United States. And I'm not saying it would solve everything. I mean, because the truth of the matter is, when you set a generation back, literally it's a snowball effect. Any amount of racism for any period of time has a very long reverberating impact on people for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, that they may never catch up. And that's kind of what I've seen here in the United States. And, like I think Martin Luther King said, you're telling a man to go pull himself up by his bootstraps. He ain't got no damn boots.
No, he doesn't.
Get a pair of boots first, right?
And it's 400 years of,
long time.
segregation, slavery, murder, and so it's going to take a long time, but we have to be willing to be at the table and just look at the design differently.
Exactly.
And, accept it. And how do we continue to learn together and learn from other countries? We're part of a global world. So how can we learn from what Scandinavia does or what, our Asian countries or our Middle Eastern countries are doing?
Yeah.
No culture and country is perfect. Yet everyone is, I think, trying to do a similar thing.
That's great. I mean, it's hard for people to look at themselves, right? And to be honest with themselves about, man, we screwed this up.
Yep.
Well, we really, maybe it wasn't me, but man, my great grandfather had a shitty job you guys did. That was really kind of wrong. What can I do? And one of the reasons I do leadership coaching is that, going back to what you were saying earlier about the school boards and leadership, I think that's what's missing for me is having bold leaders who have integrity, who have some kahunas, who will stand up to the people in Washington, D.C. and say, that ain't the way it's going down here. Say what you want to about DeSantis, not saying, like you said about the prime minister, I'm not saying I'm a DeSantis fan, not saying that I'm a Trump fan, but there are some things that I appreciated about what they both did in standing up to Washington, D.C. and saying, you know what, you do what you want to do in Washington, D.C. Here in Florida, this is how it's going in my town. And the people in Florida love them for that, And so we need people to stand up and really stand up for the people that are in those communities. And this centralization piece, you need that because if someone's not willing to come from the state of Georgia or New York or Tennessee and these places and stand up to Washington, D.C. and say, hey, we're not doing it that way. Here's how we want our money directed. And that's going to come from our Senate and our congressmen, state representatives who go up there and on our behalf to these meetings that they have up there in D.C. God knows what the hell they're talking about. I want to go back to one thing that you said.
Here's a question for you, though. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if we took economics out of government, so that's another thing about the British system, right? The British, Australian, Commonwealth system.
Okay.
Is our government officials, A, can only earn so much. 2, they can't actually take money from corporate interests. So would Trump and DeSantis even run for government if they didn't financially benefit from their own interests, right? So you have to look at the economic model throughout all of it and also recognize that when we have corporate interests in our government decision making,
of course, that
also influences the decisions on who benefits and who doesn't. And so it's starting to recognize, like I love the analogy of if politicians had racing car jackets with all the brands on them of the corporate interests that they've been funded by, then you'd be far more aware of when you vote for that person, who are you actually voting for to make decisions on your behalf. So it's once again transparency in that economic design of government. Yeah.
No question about it. Yeah. I mean, I don't think any of these guys will probably run for office because the rules are the same here. You're supposed to only earn a certain salary. The United States president is not given they're not given $1 million a year to do what they do. A congressman is not given $1 million a year to do what they do. It's a menial salary, maybe a 6-figure salary, and that's it. But it's all the fringe benefits, all the perks that they get by being in that position because they're in a position of power where they can negotiate power broker deals with corporate America. And so, the United States itself is a corporation. So the United States
Interesting.
only does business with other companies, but like any other, it's B2B, right? They do business with Pfizer, they do business with Coca-Cola, they do business with their businesses doing business with businesses. So everybody benefits. So by going up there and getting into that cesspool of mess up there, who the hell's thinking about education? They're thinking about getting rich. You know, so I think, again, pulling it back down. I'm a big fan of pulling a lot of that control back down to the state level. DC, y'all do what you do up there. We're handling what we do here in Georgia, which is where I live, the way we're doing it. California does what they do. Every state does what they do. If states want to create, which is the way it was initially designed, right? It wasn't designed for everything to feed up to DC. That happened over time. It was designed for states had their own sovereignty. And I think that's a big part that's missing in having leaders who are willing to step up and say, hey, you know what? I appreciate the money. You want to donate money? Here, take it. Let's put it into this redesign of this education system that we're doing right now, this project. So I want to go back to one thing you mentioned earlier, Dr. Kelly. You were talking about project-based learning. You sort of touched on it a little bit, going back into the education design. I've seen this shift. I have a 12-year-old who's in middle school right now, and I've been to a few of her presentations or PBL presentations. And so I know that you're a big fan of that, you know, because of the immersion aspect of, you know, the kids doing it. And you're a big fan of the inquisitive aspect of learning versus someone standing in front of a classroom. I was listening to one of your talks and you talked about even the design of the classroom where this person standing up at a podium or in front of class teaching out to the students. Whereas in, I would imagine, a Reggio type of a design, it's very different. You said round tables, students are it's more collaborative, more community based. Yeah. So, you know, what do you see as far as, you know, project-based learning and how, you know, how prevalent of a role do you see that playing and what kind of impact you would see that making?
So I see it making a big impact. Yet I think that it's limited by obviously the current education curriculum and structure, right? Gotcha. In terms of, so many educators who love project-based learning and are adopting it, they fit it around things, or it's in the project, but it's not in the way we do the classroom, or it's not because they have to follow stringent requirements in curriculum design and sharing. And that's another thing that I think, you know, coming back to your point about the education department stipulating, while I do believe in certain standards that we need in our schools and education system, I think we need a more flexibility in starting to think of not just what we're teaching, but how we're teaching. And so that teachers have more agency because, you know, one class can be very different to another class in what they need and where they're at. And so I think that's standardization actually hampers curiosity and creativity. Right. And so we have to start to think about, we're becoming too centralized, too standardized. Like I don't believe in standardized test scores because I don't believe in the tests. I think the tests are flawed in how they're designed. And therefore, we need to think differently on how we're evaluating learning and how children play a role, or adults in post-secondary play a role in their own evaluation, because that's also where you learn. So project-based learning has, once again, when you're in the workforce, it's all projects. You're constantly working on projects. So it's a style of learning that is really helping young people work together and develop projects, learn together, and take leadership over a project. And there's great skills you're learning about how to manage projects, right? So everything we do in life is a project, you know, so it's a really good way and approach to learn those things and then develop the skills for what resources you might need or who could you talk to assist with the project. So I love the mode of learning, the style of learning, and I think it lends itself to more freedom and creativity and innovation, which is really, like, I see that, to me, every teacher, you know, they're an entrepreneur because they have to bring, you've got 30 young people asking you questions. You give me Zuckerberg and put Zuckerberg in front of 30, you know, kindergarten children and trying to manage that, right? It's very different than managing a business or a company. So I think project-based learning just has the ability to have more freedom in it. Yet we have to give teachers the freedom and the skills, create space for them to use it in different environments. Interesting enough, it's always been in the sciences.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
Always.
Yeah.
And but now where it's in humanities, it's in all different kinds of different, but it's always been in the sciences. We just didn't call it project-based learning.
Very true. Very true. We called it lab. which is basically,
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. When I think about to your point of the teachers and the current design of even the classroom itself is not set up to support really project-based learning. When I went, it seemed very chunky. It's like they're struggling to try to make this happen because they don't have the resources and the tools to really support that kind of learning. And as you talked about, teachers having sort of being entrepreneurs, like we'd have to really go back to look at what's happening at the collegiate level with teachers, right? I mean, the education that they're getting that is equipping them to go out because they're being trained in a certain methodology, being trained in a certain path, and they go and implement that into the classroom. And man, in the United States, I don't know what it's like in other countries, you can share that, but in the United States, it's a struggle for teachers right now. And it's not a very glitzy, glamorous type of job that a lot of kids are pouring into education to go do. You got to really love kids and you got to really want to make a difference to go into education right now. You're not going into it for money, that's for sure. So what have you seen out there with regards to that?
Yeah, you're not going into it for money, but also the level of credentialing required is, again, it's an economic model because, it's interesting now. It's not just enough to have, so my mum's a teacher. And in my mum's day, you only required a certificate to teach in the classroom.
Right.
Now you require actually a degree and a master's degree. And, there's this promise of certain things that you will get for teaching, yet your salary, it does not equate to it's the same in other industries if you have a master's degree.
Yeah.
So the way we compensation for our educators, we need to look at that model and see why is it like it is? Why are so many leaving? Why do so many teachers spend, I think it's anywhere up to $500-$600 a month of their own money on resources for the classroom?
Crazy.
So
or they have the parents, Dr. Kelly, they have the parents. We donate paper towels, toilet paper, why are we donating this stuff? I just paid $8,000 in taxes last year. Why am I giving you stuff like snacks? And it's crazy.
So it's really important to look at, to go into teaching, whereas in other countries, and I'll pick out the Scandinavian countries, being a teacher is equivalent to being a medical doctor.
Wow.
That's how it's respected by society. They're paid equivalent to a medical doctor.
Wow.
Because you are having an impact on the next generation. So it's valued. Years ago when I first moved to America, I was part of an innovation group, and we were looking at government spending on different things. And it was really interesting to see the budget for education versus the budget for military, right? Now, we can go here and you can really talk about the difference. But we looked at the decision-making and the amount of evidence educators and researchers had to give to change the budget on education. Whereas with the military, it was just like, we need to spend on A, B, and C, and they were issued with it. So it wasn't even, so the value is different.
Right.
And what we're requiring of our schools to even get more funding, that's also something we need to look at because we're making it harder and harder.
Yep.
As opposed to it should be easier for us to actually be able to fund certain things in our districts and our schools.
Yeah.
So there's a big conversation around the finances. And if we're not talking about the business model of school, because we always talk about the learning model, right? Project-based learning, problem-based learning, Reggio, Montessori, what have you. We don't talk enough about the business model and go, okay, how's this economics not working for us?
Right.
And how can we do it differently? But it has to change. If education is to be seen as a public good here in America, then we have to invest in it like we do our roads, like we do other parts of our infrastructure, like we do our military. And so that's a really important thing to look at in terms of its design. And then teachers will have money to live, just to pay the bills, not having to do 2 jobs and 3 jobs.
They are.
To do what they love. Yeah.
They are. And the credentialing piece you talk about, it's like they're tasked with this question. Okay, if I go get this master's degree and go spend another 50, 60 grand getting a master's degree, to come back and make $10,000 more in salary. It just, the economics don't make sense. That's a backwards investment. Who would do that?
It doesn't make sense. And then credentialing, they require state licenses as well.
Exactly.
And you have to keep up your license just like a medical doctor.
Right.
So you have to do micro-credentialing throughout the year to show evidence of the skills that you've updated throughout. So you have this pressure of constant evaluation. And it's interesting because they also have to pay for their licenses to be a teacher. So it's an interesting, we're kind of strangling the creativity from our educators.
Right.
And instead of recognizing that, licenses are important, but also state licenses differ. So if I have a state license, and I once interviewed, I had a teacher as part of some of my research, and she went from, Alabama to Tennessee, and she had to get reevaluated because some of her qualifications, they needed to reassess. And I'm like, you're going from Alabama to Tennessee. Surely the state licensing and the credentialing should be equivalent. And then the payment that she had to do. And while she was waiting for her reaccreditation, she got a job as a school bus driver. That's what she
serious?
did. Yeah. And so that was her pathway into teaching in a new state while she waited for her credentials she had done like 15, 20 years in Alabama. And so I was like, wow. So that's where I actually argue for federal systems.
Wow. Because
there are certain things that I think we can standardize across the country. And then there are certain things that have to be at a state level.
Right.
To be equivalent. But so that our teachers, I give them, we need to do a lot more for them.
No question.
And to recognize them. And also, if we want to have especially more Black men in the classroom, there was a study done that actually identified that, when you think of the identity as a Black man in America, as also your leading the household, and there is a certain identity, being paid $45,000 a year, $60,000 a year. So there was an interesting study done that I can share with you.
Yeah.
That's why we don't have many Black men in education. And it's fascinating to sort of look at the pathway to a career that's valued in society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You could even say it's men in general,
Yes.
Black men, of course, are specific. But if you looked at men across the board, if I go to my daughter's school or any school, when I was growing up, there were a lot of men in education. Like my middle school, and there was so many men. They kept us in line too. Boy, you walking down the hallway acting a fool, they're gonna knock you upside the head. And get, and you need that in the schools. Now you have in there. You got the county police officers in there, like with guns and tasers and stuff. It's crazy. And then I'm not saying that we don't need to have security because they have done some crazy things that have happened at the schools here in the last couple of decades. And, so we do need to make sure we shore those things up. But it's like, there are not many men in there. And men,
not at all.
You're trying to take care of a household and raise children and be a provider, 45, 50 grand a year is not going to cut it. So they go and do different things. Really great. So, Dr. Kelly, I want to sort of start wrapping this up, and I really want you to give us a couple of things. Like, I know you're looking at this from a mass scale, and this is a big. This is a big moving target, right? Mm-hmm. That you're trying to really impact and sort of move in a particular direction. If you could give the listeners, like who are parents who have and have kids in school, or if they just want to make an impact in their local community and their local school systems, what's 2 action items that they could do, 2 to 3 things they could do now to start making an impact and moving things in a more, beneficial direction for not only the children, but for the community at large and for the world?
So I would say, firstly is, I really identifying what is it in your community that you're really passionate about. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the school or the education. It could be about homelessness. It could be about, it could be about technology and data. There could be, what is something that you truly value, believe in, and think that human beings should have more of a say in.
Okay.
And then find the groups that are already working on it. Because this is already happening. There are groups across the country that are working in different ways, a more decentralized way, to have more role and more say in their community, and participate. That is the only way we change, is by actually coming together to actually change this. Also identifying the organizations across the country that are doing the work more at a state level or at a national level, and how you could support. So there are a number of nonprofits in the country. Opportunity Now is one organization that is really doing work to open up pathways for jobs and opportunities for people that weren't open to them before. So it's like, how can you get involved in their research, being a participant, but ensure you get paid? So that's one thing I always say. If you're going to participate, what is the economic model, right? The only way we shift it is by financially. But that's what I would really encourage people to do. And I think there's a fear for me that we're becoming very passive and that we're stepping back. It's not going to change, so why bother? The government's not going to change, so why vote? And I'm actually not, well, the only way it's going to change is if by us actually participating, coming together and doing things, even if it's just in your community.
Right.
But also, what about your household? So how are you designing your household differently so that people have more of a role and a say in how they're being raised and what's going on in the family, so that you're building the mindset of a designer?
Yeah. In a lot of households, the kids are told what to do, right? They're taught to, and they'll do this, do that. And then you go to school, it's the same thing. So you kind of get brainwashed into thinking this is the way the world works. Apparently you get told what to do and you just do it or you don't. And if you don't do it, there's implications, there's impact if you're not doing it. So yeah, there's a wire, sort of a brain wiring and behavior wiring that you're talking about that happens even at home. So yeah, there's definitely some things we can do at home to impact that. So
at the end of the day, you are a designer, right? You are a designer. No matter what anyone makes you think you believe, you are a designer of your world.
Whether it's micro or macro, you have the ability to make a difference. Man, great stuff. Really great conversation. So is there anything else you want to share with us before we wrap this thing up and put a bow on it? Anything else you want to share that we haven't covered? You feel good about what you've shared with the world here and that we're going to put out there about this message?
No, I think I'm really glad of the conversation. I think this has been fantastic to really dig into the economic model of things and the social design of things. And how just ask the question, right, of the design, and do not be afraid of being canceled. There it is. There is a world out there called the World Wide Web, and you can set up your own website. You can do your own thing. It's like, don't be afraid of being canceled. Speak your truth and authentic truth.
And stand in it. I love it.
Yeah.
Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for everything you're doing. I mean, we need more people like you out there. And I agree. I think there is certainly a passiveness in general because we do feel powerless. We do feel like the people are going to do what they want to do. Why even bother? Let's just try to take care of our own house, which is important too. Like you said, take care of home, take care of your local area. That's important. But also that doesn't mean that you can't have a bigger impact, and what I also hear you saying is don't reinvent the wheel. There's parents and communities out there that are already doing this kind of work, that already have seen the problems and they're already working on those problems. So just go find those people, partner up with them and see where you can get in and make a difference as well.
Yeah, 100%.
I got that. Awesome. And thank you so much so if people want to follow you and follow your work, where do they go? I know you got a website. I found you on LinkedIn and got connected with you on LinkedIn. So where can people get connected and find more about the work that you're doing? And if they want to get involved with you, I can do that.
I'm on every social channel you can imagine. To understand the social design of technology, I have to use it. I got to participate. So you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Instagram. I do have a website, drkellypage.com. But other than that, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm one of those souls that does reply. So yeah, you can find me pretty much everywhere, or just Google me and it'll come up.
Awesome. Dr. Kelly, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Wonderful conversation. And again, thank you so much for what you're doing. And if you're ever in the Atlanta area, look me up. Take you for coffee.
Oh, I certainly will.
All right.
Definitely.
Take care of yourself.
Right,
See you soon.
This is Doris Brown's baby boy. We out.